All right. It's my pleasure to have back on Bad Faith Podcast. I think one of the most important voices in the left media space, someone who never keeps his nose off of the proverbial grindstone in terms of going into the field and finding the stories and continuing to report on the stories that really matter long after national attention has moved away from them. Of course, I'm talking about Jordan Chariton of Status Coup, who's also here with a new book, We the Poisoned, exposing the Flint Water Crisis cover-up and the poisoning of 100,000 Americans, which will be out in just a couple of weeks. Welcome back to the show, Jordan.
Hey, thank you for having me.
It really is my pleasure. I think what you do is so important, and I'm really looking forward to talking with you today about your book and your continued coverage of the all of the water crises are now combining in my head. The East Palestine train derailment toxicity crisis, which is now coming up with a different sort of a valence politically, given the choice of J.D. Vance for vice president on the Donald Trump ticket, of course, a senator from Ohio, where the train derailment happened. But first, I did want to pick your brain a little bit about current events. Before we started recording, I was asking you a little bit how you're feeling about what might be some of the most consequential 3 or 4 weeks in all of American political history. The most recent news of which being that Kamala seems to be coronated as a de facto replacement for Joe Biden. He announced his support for her digitally. Of course, we haven't seen him yet, but announced his support for her digitally after he dropped out of the race just a couple of days ago as we're recording this. How are you feeling about it all?
I just have this scene in my head. I remember reporting on fundraisers in 2020, and I remember there was a scene with her at a donor's Fifth Avenue penthouse in New York City, stroking a poodle. And that's kind of what I think of Kamala Harris. It's kind of nothing will fundamentally change with a more yes queen vibe to it. I think Kamala Harris is a kind of very good example of the last 20, 30 years of, the neoliberal order. I think she verbally won't offend, but if you look at her track record and policies, they are pretty status quo, pretty pro Wall Street, pretty pro cop, as they call her, cop Mala. There's been some horrifying reporting of things she did as Attorney General of California. And I think, there's no evidence. There's no evidence really that she has a strong ideological core. The reporting has kind of indicated that she's tried to stay away from, labels or being a progressive or, more moderate, that she's very hunkered down on policy. But, I see really not a lot of departure that she would have from Biden. And I see that, if she's elected, on major things, I think, objectively, perhaps she'd be better than Trump. But on, income inequality, on housing, on healthcare, climate, I think we're going to get more of the same.
Yeah, it's interesting. I saw a kind of a tweet trying to explain the coconut pilling and why so many leftists, or at least left-leaning people, seem sort of excited about Kamala Harris. Because someone had asked the question, well, what happened to Kamala? What happened to all of the antagonism from 2020? Did you guys just forget about it? And the response was, well, back in 2020, we were comparing her to the other options we had, Bernie and Elizabeth Warren. Now we're comparing her to what we just got out of in Joe Biden, and the comparison is very flattering to her. And I do think there is something to that. I think that descriptively, that's right. But sort of ideologically, it feels like a mistake, especially if you believe that she is at least more persuadable than Biden, more easily influenced than Biden. If you believe that the party chose her and pushed Biden out, not just because of his age and kind of cognitive decline, but also because they recognize perhaps that Biden was vulnerable on certain issues like Gaza, then that tacit acknowledgement means, if anything, that you should be pushing her harder. You should be withholding your vote harder. You should be conditioning your vote harder. And that doesn't seem to be where a lot of the energy is right now. I mean, what's your read?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I also think you can delude yourself into thinking, we remember Bernie said, hold your nose and we'll, fight Biden on day one to move him left. It's well past day one. That hasn't happened. But with Kamala Harris, if she's elected, I think it's kind of delusional to think you could move her left, because she is not going to want to do many things that would, I think, distance herself from Biden's record. I don't think there's evidence that she's bold enough to, take more humanitarian or, I think just common sense leftist policy on Gaza, for example, or the military budget or climate, because I don't think, particularly since, Biden would be mostly responsible for helping her get elected by stepping aside, that she would want to ruffle feathers by departing from that, school of thinking and that policy perspective. I think there's another element. I think of Obama, who I think it's an excuse that many use for him, but many said, well, as the first Black president, he did not want to do anything that would be too, radical or a departure from the status quo, because he didn't want to be seen as, legislating for the Black community, for example, or he wanted to be seen, as just a normal president. And we got that. He allowed Wall Street to foreclose on millions and did not hold them accountable. Everything else, doubled down on Afghanistan. I think if Kamala Harris were elected, I think that could be an element just on the opposite side, the first woman president. Would she, based on her record and temperament, want to do anything that left or that against Wall Street status quo as the first woman president? I see a lot of similarities between Obama being the first Black president and her possibly being the first woman president. I don't think she'd want to kind of ruffle feathers or do anything outside of the normal order, so to speak, as the first woman president.
It certainly would be interesting, and I think really dangerous, since the only, I think, saving grace the Democrats possibly have is having enough of the public afraid about having their abortion rights stripped away that they'll vote Democrat. I mean, when we were assessing Biden's likelihood of winning, all of those days ago when he was still the nominee, the only thing I ever thought gave him a saving chance, as evidenced by the success of pro-choice ballot measures across the country over the course of the last year or so, was people's right to choose. And he struggled mightily as a Catholic and seemingly reluctant advocate of women's rights to choose, to make the case for abortion. And they were already kind of deputizing Kamala to be the campaign's mouthpiece for that particular issue. And now she's being talked about flatteringly as someone who can do a much better job than Biden at carrying that message across the transom. Now, if what you say is true, which I'm going to have some skepticism about, but if she ever, experienced reluctance about hitting that hard as a quote unquote women's issue, then that's truly the death knell for her, even more so than early polls are already suggesting that she's going to have a really rough time of it. But I want to come back to something that you said a little while ago about her and her kind of corporate background, her choice not to prosecute Steve Mnuchin as AG in California. Matt Stoller tweeted out a clip from Jim Cramer recently, and he wrote, Jim Cramer says that Kamala Harris will fire Lena Khan and Jonathan Katner over their antitrust cases against big tech firms, highlights that Harris's brother-in-law and advisor, Tony West, is the general counsel of Uber.
Biden has been and remains unsophisticated about the way business works, unsophisticated about the stock market by nature, picks people who have been historically bad for Wall Street, Lena Khan, Jonathan Cantor, antitrust. That ends entirely. You've got a person who's from California. I'm regarding this actually as mega versus MAGA. Mega tech does better with someone who's sophisticated, who understands California, who is not against tech. Biden has done everything in these agencies that he can to annoy, to go after tech. Let's not forget, her brother-in-law is Tony West, who is a former general counsel of PepsiCo, then was with the Justice Department, is now the general counsel of Uber. And you tell me if there's someone who's more sophisticated and knows more about business and the West Coast than her brother-in-law, who would be an amazing advisor. They're close. And I just keep thinking this is going to be globalist versus nativist, not nationalist, nativist.
Yes.
Populist in terms of the Republican Party versus pro-business versus the Democrat, international business. These are very big differences, and I have followed her career and followed Biden's career. And if Biden didn't hurt the stock market at all. It's pretty amazing how well the Biden administration's done. But this whole idea that she's a clone of his is completely wrong.
So
she was much more moderate than he was.
So you think it's a net positive for the markets?
Absolutely.
And for American business?
Absolutely.
And I do think that's worth reminding people of as well, that whether or not do you think it's fair to kind of judge her on the basis of these family ties, it is troubling to think of her close proximity to someone who was supportive of, I think everybody probably remembers what was a Prop 22 campaign to not allow Uber drivers, or to force the Uber drivers to identify as contractors as opposed to employees, and therefore be precluded from all of their rights that would otherwise accrue.
Yeah. And I think of Thomas Frank's book, Listen Liberal, which I think was a terrific book. You got to remember, Kamala Harris is 20-something years younger than Joe Biden.
Mm-hmm.
She kind of came up in what was defined in Thomas Frank's book.
30 years.
30 years,
How old
yeah.
is she?
59, maybe? I think.
Oh, okay. I guess then only 20 odd years younger. No, yeah. She's almost 60, yeah.
But she kind of, I think, buys into this the managerial class and the creative class with the buzzwords in the professional managerial class of innovation, and Silicon Valley being a bastion for economic development and urban renewal and creative hubs. This is a lot of the phrasing that has come up in the technocratic, neoliberal, corporate Democratic establishment, a departure from the blue-collar, working-class roots of the Democratic Party of yesteryear, FDR, except even JFK to a certain extent. So I think she has a positive view of Silicon Valley, of the professional managerial class, Wall Street, and I think that's how she would legislate. On abortion, I think she would be to the liking of most on the left. I actually think it was a mistake for Trump to pick J.D. Vance, who's on the record for wanting a national abortion ban. He's talked about wanting to track or have governments kind of track women's menstrual cycles. He's been for legislation that would try to go after women who travel out of state for abortion. That might not be Trump, but that is who he picked, and Trump's old too. So I think Harris will be able to, quote, prosecute the case against both of them. But on domestic issues, on the economy, I think she's very much of the Democratic Party of the last 20, 30 years that is all in for big tech, innovation, creativity, and not really investing in labor unions, blue collar issues. If she wants to win, abortion's an issue. She could right now say, if you give me the Senate and the House, we're going to push for a $20 minimum wage, and to hell with the parliamentarian. That certainly would help. I don't think she's going to do that based on the fact that reports are Wall Street is popping champagne, and her record has been very Hillary Clinton, having public positions and private positions. She is a friend of Wall Street, and Wall Street does not want, a significantly higher minimum wage, public option, and all the things, that Biden ran on and then abandoned.
Yeah, it does seem like wishful thinking. I've seen people kind of resurface her 2020 campaign promises, saying that she supported getting rid of the filibuster, all the stuff that Biden was obviously opposed to, and which significantly impeded his ability to actually effectuate his agenda. Now, whether or not you think he's like, oh, shucks, I wish I could effectuate my agenda, or that's all part of the plan, depends on your level of cynicism. But now people coming back around and saying, oh, remember when she was for all of these progressive things? Remember she supported, quote unquote, Medicare for all and student debt cancellation. at least of that bizarre variety where if you hula hooped in a low income neighborhood while jumping on one foot for 3 years, you could get 2.5% of your debt canceled, or whatever her Byzantine plan was. There's like a weird sort of breathless optimism that's coming from ranks that I would expect to know better. And I don't mean this judgmentally, but it is sort of destabilizing, especially since we're still seeing such horrific images coming out of Palestine, which has been the galvanizing issue most recently. Moving from that, though, in Palestine to
I'll just say real quick. I don't really care what she's running on or what she says she's for. I care what her record and actions was. As soon as she became a senator, she didn't immediately sign on to Medicare for All, which, she signed on to it once she decided to run for president. And then within, I think, 48 hours of announcing her run, she quickly backtracked on supporting Medicare for All.
I intend to co-sponsor the Medicaid for All bill. And because it's just the right thing to do. I am proud to co-sponsor it. It is about saying that this is about a right, not about a privilege for a few. You don't have to go through the process of going through an insurance company. Let's eliminate all of that.
Medicare for All would effectively eliminate private insurance. It would essentially phase out private insurance companies
as the main source, but there would still be supplemental. There'd still be access to supplemental.
Okay.
It was in the context of saying, let's get rid of all the bureaucracy. Let's get all of the ways.
Oh, not the insurance companies.
No, that's not what I meant. I support Medicare for All. It is my preferred
as a principle, you mean, not Bernie Sanders' bill?
I support the bill.
Okay.
I support the bill.
Well, because the bill gets rid of private insurance for everything that
it doesn't get rid of supplemental insurance.
Right, for cosmetic surgery, but for all.
So it doesn't get rid of all insurance.
Who here would abolish their private health insurance in favor of a government-run plan? All right.
Do you believe that private insurance should be eliminated in this country?
No.
You don't?
No, I do not.
But you raised your hand last night.
But the question was, would you give up your private insurance for that option? And I said yes. My plan will separate your health care from your employer, meaning your employer will no longer dictate the kind of health care you receive. Under my plan of Medicare for All, private insurance companies will be able to provide coverage if they play by our rules.
There's other, things like that. I don't remember anything some signature legislation she sponsored or initiated as senator before running for president. So, Biden ran on some things and then quickly abandoned it too. I know people are excited because you're going from a non-coherent dinosaur to someone who could speak and is younger, but you got to look at policy. What, by her record, has been her North Star that she's stuck with that would help the working class? I really can't think of anything.
Yeah, I'm old enough to remember, Jordan, when during the 2020 debates, there was a question about would you get rid of private health insurance? And I believe Bernie Sanders and Kamala were the only ones to raise their hands, except she immediately walked it back. There were multiple instances, you're right, where she immediately walked back these kind of moments of progressivism. And that means one of two things. Either she just can't remember her policy stances and made a genuine mistake repeatedly, or she's someone who somewhere deep inside maybe does have instincts to be more progressive leaning, but is willing to bend the knee to what her advisors, or in this instance, perhaps the people who put her in the position to be the next president of the United States, have told her she needs to believe in order to grasp that ring. And to me personally, that might even be worse, to have some genuine lefty sort of instincts and desires, but to be willing to sublimate them to advance your own power.
Mm-hmm. And also, reports are her fundraising fell off a cliff after she backtracked for Medicare for All, which was the same thing that happened to Elizabeth Warren. So she seems to be responding to donor pressure. The donors were not happy once she, in that town hall in 2020, said, I'm for Medicare for All. And then within 48 hours, between the media and the donors, she backtracked. Well, her fundraising, which was surging after she did that zinger against Biden in the debate.
And I will say also that in this campaign, we've also heard, and I'm going to now direct this at Vice President Biden, I do not believe you are a racist. And I agree with you when you commit yourself to the importance of finding common ground. But I also believe, and it's personal, and I was actually it was hurtful to hear you talk about the reputations of two United States senators who built their reputations and career on the segregation of race in this country. And it was not only that, but you also worked with them to oppose busing. And, you know, there was a little girl in California who was part of the second class to integrate her public schools. And she was bused to school every day. And that little girl was me.
After she said she was for Medicare for all, fell off a cliff. So she seems to, maybe deep down, she's got progressive roots. Once upon a time, so did Nancy Pelosi in the 90s. That quickly changed.
Well, look, let's go back to the VP on the other side of the aisle, because J.D. Vance not only is in the news because of being picked by Trump, but also because he is from the state of Ohio, where the East Palestine derailment actually happened. And as we're getting into that conversation here today, plays a significant role as a figure in the region to the people of East Palestine, who have seen him alternately as someone who has been paying a lot of attention, who seems to have been very supportive, who they looked to as someone who might actually provide some real help, assistance, and support to them, and then over time have lost confidence in them. So walk us through what's been going on. Perhaps we can start with a little bit of a refresher of what has happened since I think the country was more focused on the derailment that happened, 2 Februaries ago?
Yeah, I was just there a few months ago. I got sick. So contrary to what the EPA and J.D. Vance and, the Biden administration claim, it is a chemical petri dish. It's been described to me by chemical experts and chemists as a mini Chernobyl. And it's kind of sad and sick that this could fall out of the news, because you just have to be there for a few hours. I'm a healthy dude. I got really bad headaches, burning under my eyes in certain sections of town. And this was almost a year and a half after. And I think derailment has a kind of, it undersells it. The actual cause of the catastrophe wasn't the derailment itself. There's a lot of derailments around the country. It was that Norfolk Southern, a multi-billion-dollar railroad company, chemically nuked this town and surrounding areas. There was a new report that this plume went to 16 states. They, after the derailment, 3 days later, unnecessarily, I think criminally, decided to blow up 5 trains of toxic vinyl chloride, which created other chemicals. And residents, I mean, we could go down the list. I've talked to residents who are having seizures, who were healthy before this, strokes, bloody noses, bloody stools, bloody urine, body tingling, cognitive issues. Women's menstrual cycles have been affected, reproductive issues. There's now cancer. Obviously, I can't directly say cause and effect, but a man we interviewed had a double breast cancer and a double mastectomy. That's pretty rare in men. Vinyl chloride is linked to this, and the EPA under this president has covered it up. And J.D. Vance, I mean, the timeline, this happened a month after J.D. Vance was sworn in as a senator. This could have been a heroic moment for him to take aggressive action on behalf of, he likes to say, I'm a populist from Appalachia. This is Appalachia. Residents I've spoke to and emails I've seen, he showed up at the beginning, was responsive, and that kind of quickly dissipated. Your home, which I've interviewed you at, is chemically contaminated. You've been sick. So many of you are sick. I am obviously not going to blame everything in East Palestine on J.D. Vance, but he is a U.S. senator, and now he could be a heartbeat away from the presidency. Am I missing something? Has he called for a criminal investigation into Norfolk Southern?
No.
Go ahead.
No, he hasn't called for one. We've been waiting. Charges need criminally charged. There are other entities along with Norfolk Southern that needs criminally charged. JD Vance was wonderful in the beginning with coming in, sending his assistance or help, and then all of a sudden we don't hear from him. And we ran into one of his at the NTSB hearing, but we've never heard anything from them since. And this is still very serious, and we have been forgotten once again.
His office has been responsive to residents via email, but hasn't actually done much for them. He, while auditioning to be Trump's vice president and now this election, has a major microphone to speak up about this, to say they should be evacuated. There's still massive chemicals that are making residents sick, not just in East Palestine, but Western Pennsylvania, where that plume went to. He's doing none of that. And we confronted him. My colleague Lewis confronted him months ago, asking, hey, should Norfolk Southern, be criminally charged? He dodged it.
Do you think anyone should be held criminally liable for the decision to detonate those cars? A resident I've been speaking with said that they spoke with the former Vice President Al Gore at one point, who thinks that something could be criminal there. But the ultimate decision to detonate the cars seems like it was unnecessary.
Well, the NTSB report is going to come out soon. One thing I'd say, and I should have mentioned this earlier, is it's really important that we not have a federal settlement with Norfolk Southern before the NTSB report. It's like, why would you try to memory hole and prevent discovery on an accident before you even have the accident report?
Right.
Look, we'll see what the NTSB report says. My strong suspicion is there were a lot of mistakes. Whether they're criminal mistakes, I got to see more evidence before I can say that. See you guys.
Thank you.
And then there was a Senate hearing a few months ago where the NTSB chair told him, we have evidence that Norfolk Southern lied to Governor DeWine of Ohio, lied to the East Palestine fire chief, withheld information from them that resulted in them approving this detonation of the chemicals. He himself said it sure seems like this company might have poisoned the town to reopen the tracks quicker.
I won't ask you to speak to motivations here, but when you have an unnecessary, uncontrolled burn that poisoned a lot of people, that then led to rapid transit of train traffic, a lot of people, including me, are wondering, did they do this not because it was necessary, but because it allowed them to move traffic and freight more quickly? And if so, that is an extraordinary thing that I think requires a lot of further work from this committee and from others. But we will stop there because I see my time is up. Thank you, Chair Hamady.
May I add something to that?
Please.
Senator, it's even, I would say the factual information in our docket shows that oxyvinyls was on scene and providing information to Norfolk Southern and their contractors on the 4th, 5th, and 6th. They informed them that polymerization, they believed polymerization was not occurring and there was no justification to do a vent and burn. Rightfully, Norfolk Southern's contractors said, ruled out hot tapping and transloading because it would have been a potential safety issue for their employees, but there was another option, let it cool down. It was cooling down. We know for a fact that when that pressure relief device went off, that it had to have been above 185 degrees. Later, much later, over the course of 22 hours, that tank car was cooling, not to mention the other 4 tank cars that were only between 64 and 69 degrees. So oxyvinyls was on scene providing information to Norfolk Southern's contractor, who was in the room when the decision was made, and when advice was given to the governor of Ohio, to the incident commander. They were not given full information because no one was told oxyvinyl was on scene. They were left out of the room. The incident commander didn't even know they existed. Neither did the governor. So they were provided incomplete information to make a decision.
Yes, go ahead, Senator Vance.
Your mic.
My line of questioning, I just want to be clear here, is not a criticism of the incident commander or of the governor. I think it's a criticism of the people on the ground who provided inadequate information. And provided inadequate information, I think, to the great detriment of the community on the ground. This is extraordinary work by your team, but this is a really, really troubling set of circumstances. This town very, very well may have been poisoned to facilitate the rapid movement of freight, or at the very least, it was poisoned for reasons that we can't identify. That should really concern every single person on this committee.
Yet he hasn't called for an investigation, hasn't called for criminal charges, and has not done anything that I know of to advocate for relocating sick residents permanently.
So take us back just for a second. You, I think, rightly pointed out that the derailment isn't the but-for cause of the widespread distribution of these toxic chemicals. It was the choice to do what has been described as a controlled explosion of these train cars that were filled with this toxic chemical. And the contention is that the controlled explosion of these cars was not necessary for safety reasons. It was done to open up the tracks and to be able to facilitate basically commerce. For financial reasons, they wanted to do the quickest, most expedient thing, even if it was at the direct cost of the health of the local community.
Yes. So right off the bat, red flags. You had Norfolk Southern controlling the emergency response in the 48 hours after this derailment. Doesn't make a lot of sense to have the railroad company that just derailed controlling the emergency response. You would think that would be the fire department, local authorities. And during that 48 hours between the Friday night derailment and the Monday controlled burn, which was not controlled whatsoever, it's an oxymoron. You can't control the detonation of 5 cars of cancerous chemicals. The manufacturer of the chemicals was on scene. The manufacturer of the toxic vinyl chloride was on scene, repeatedly advising Norfolk Southern that the cars' temperatures were cooling, that there was no risk of an imminent explosion, and that really you just need to let the cars cool down, which would have taken several days, possibly a week. And then they could have, in a meticulous manner, extracted the chemicals from the car. Well, Norfolk Southern, by reports, was going to lose $1 million a day if they let that process play out. So Norfolk Southern not only discarded the chemical car manufacturer's advice, they blocked them from the emergency response meetings. The chemical car companies were not in the meetings. And Governor DeWine and the fire chief, they're not chemical experts. They had to approve this detonation of the cars. Norfolk Southern withheld from them the fact that the experts, the chemical manufacturer, was telling them they did not have to do this. In fact, Norfolk Southern wanted to do the controlled burn at like 10 a.m. on Monday morning. They were stopped, thankfully, because kids were still in school. They wanted to do it much earlier. So there is evidence from the NTSB report, from the chemical car company's testimony, that this was not necessary. And J.D. Vance testified in front of the NTSB. He said, well, it sure seems like Norfolk Southern might have poisoned, his words, this town to open up the railroad tracks quicker. And we also have evidence Norfolk Southern buried contaminated soil under the track almost instantly to expedite the reopening of the train, that route. They buried contaminated soil. It was the residents screaming about it that led the EPA to demand that they dig that up. So we have evidence that basically a multi-billion-dollar company chemically nuked, I don't know what other way to put it, this town. And it's beyond East Palestine. I think that's what's been lost. You can't explode 5 cars of cancerous chemicals that then turn into other chemicals, dioxins, formaldehyde, hydrochloric acid, carbon dioxide. I had people messaging me from as far as New Hampshire, Maine, and Canada about stuff that was falling from the sky and people having symptoms. So if you are a populist, and it's not all on him, by the way, Democratic Senator Sherrod Brown has not done enough The Pennsylvania senators, Mr. Israel, John Fetterman, has barely done anything. But Vance, he says he's a populist. His people, this was made a sacrifice zone. He said to us when we confronted him, I need to see more evidence. Well, there's evidence. The NTSB report basically says Norfolk Southern intentionally did this and unnecessarily did this. He's not calling for criminal charges. The settlement is $600 million. That might sound like a lot. It's really crumbs. And this is, you put your legal hat on. You ever heard of a company settling within a year for something like this? I believe Norfolk Southern is settling now before there is a massive surge in cancer. I think they're trying to get out of it with as little as possible. And insult to injury, this settlement, it will take away money that residents were reimbursed. So if you get, let's say, $70,000 from Norfolk Southern, they're going to subtract whatever money you were reimbursed for temporary relocation, which was not the residents' fault. I think this is one. Flint is different. I don't want to compare the two, but it is eerily similar in terms of the government, the playbook of the cover-up, and politicians kind of, checking the boxes. He showed up in town. He inspected the creeks. His office is responding to residents. I don't hear him calling for universal health care for residents. I don't hear him calling for free medical testing for the rest of their lives. I don't hear him calling for Norfolk Southern or the government to pay for permanent relocation, which residents are fighting for. And from what residents have told me, conveniently around the same time he started auditioning to be Trump's vice president, he and his office were a lot less responsive.
So I want to talk to you about this sort of timeline of J.D. Vance's involvement, because as you pointed out, your colleague, Louis DeAngelis, who's been on the show before, who came on Rising a number of times, interviewed Vance back in February and, asked if he would call for a criminal investigation. J.D. Vance says, we'll put the clip in here. Basically, yes, it seems I need more evidence to see if there's criminal liability, but definitely worth looking into. Okay, fine, fair enough. Then in March, as you alluded to, there was this Senate hearing with the National Transit Safety Board NTSB chair. And she basically says, yes, there is clear evidence that the reason that these train cars were blown up had everything to do with financial incentives and nothing to do with the safety incentives. So that's the point, it would seem to me, that would trigger the next stage of, okay, we need to start having some criminal accountability, which doesn't seem to have happened since then. So what do you make of where J.D. Vance is now? Because there's been a lot of discussion about his populist bona fides and how much they should be credited, whether or not he is a friend or enemy of working people, given the way that he's characterized his family in his own book, and whether or not, even if he did have these real bona fides, he would be willing to act on them as a VP who does not obviously have the same power as the president of the United States and whose interests do conflict with Trump's at various points here. I want to hear specifically what the people on the ground seem to make of J.D. Vance and the Republican response to this, generally speaking, because it did seem in the immediate aftermath of the crisis that Trump and Republicans were seen as being much more responsive. There was almost a tracker counting the days that had gone by where Biden did not visit East Palestine. Trump famously showed up and bought everybody McDonald's. But it does feel from your reporting that people's perspective of who actually has been supporting them has shifted. Not that Democrats are doing anything at all, mind you, but that Republicans also seem to be fair weather friends here.
Yeah, all I could tell you is the emails I've reviewed between Vance's office and residents and the residents I've spoken with. There are some residents, to be fair, that are appreciative because his office has at least responded to them. That has dropped off recently, but let's say over the last year, they've at least responded to them. But the emails I'm reading are basically them saying, thanks for sending me this information. Okay, but they're not doing anything after that. Vance's office has been sent independent testing, chemical testing, separate from the EPA's testing, that find high levels of dioxins, which are cancer causing, vinyl chloride, which is the toxic gas that was detonated from these cars. Testimony in these emails I've read from chemists who say these chemicals that are being detected by independent testers will cause neurological issues and possible cancer. I haven't seen J.D. Vance do a press conference on this. I haven't seen him produce a bill to relocate any of these residents. I haven't seen him criticize Norfolk Southern once. And the timeline you're talking about, listen, if you want to give him the benefit of the doubt, when we confronted him in February, he said, well, I'm waiting for the final NTSB report, and we need to see more evidence. Well, the final NTSB report came out soon after that. And like you said, I mean, it was a stunning clip. If we had a sane media system, it would have been leading the evening broadcast. The NTSB chair was very direct. She didn't mince words. Norfolk Southern intentionally and unnecessarily detonated these cars to open up the rail lines quicker and lied to the governor and the fire chief. I mean, Boeing right now is under the spotlight for criminal malfeasance. This is even more obvious. Norfolk Southern experts, chemists, and the chemical car company said the temperatures were cooling. So residents appreciate that they've at least been responsive, but the residents I'm talking to have basically said, it's basically lip service from Vance, Sherrod Brown's office, and others. I just interviewed a resident a few weeks ago who's very sick. She said they were great in the beginning, but suddenly we don't hear from them anymore. And she saw one of Vance's people at the NTSB hearing that just happened in East Palestine, where they produced their final report and kind of was stonewalled. So it seems to me there's a lot of check the box. Vance dispatched some of his people to East Palestine, to keep tabs on it. But he's not doing the bold things that need to be done. He's not calling for Norfolk Southern or and politically speaking, it would be pretty smart to criticize the Biden administration for not cleaning this up, criticize the Biden administration for not forcing Norfolk Southern to pay for permanent relocation for those who want, not demanding that the Biden administration provide universal health care. The Montana senator back in the day during the Obamacare fight, he did what you're saying. He said, you want my vote, Obama, for Obamacare? Give my people in Libby, Montana, free health care because they had an asbestos disaster, and I'll vote for Obamacare. And Obama conceded, and they have free health care in Libby, Montana. Hundreds of people died because of an asbestos disaster, which they should. Vance hasn't done any of that. And I have to say, Trump could say whatever he wants, and the right wing could be fooled by it. Trump has not drained the swamp. He put the CEO of ExxonMobil as his Secretary of State. And there's plenty of examples of him, filling the swamp. I think Vance, who I think was eyeing potentially vice president or a cabinet position, possibly 6 months ago, I think I can't get in his head, but probably wouldn't have been smart politics to call for criminal charges against Norfolk Southern, who, by the way, over parent company is BlackRock. Probably would not have been smart with the Republican donors, with just the whole apparatus of, Republican politics. I don't think Trump would have really, had the appetite for that. But bottom line, if you go to East Palestine, which I've been there recently, I'm going back soon. I mean, like I said, residents are sick and the list is very long and it's been swept under the rug. And by the way, I should say this, Biden's EPA, a lot of people are fooled and think, oh, the EPA just went rogue under Trump. No, the EPA has been captured long ago under Democrats and Republicans. I broke a couple weeks ago that the EPA detected vinyl chloride in the soil in East Palestine and did not tell the public. They had been claiming for months, they had been claiming for a year and a half, we're not detecting it in the air. We're not detecting it in the soil. Well, they did detect it. I got text messages showing an EPA official told residents we recently detected it. I reached out to the EPA. They wouldn't answer me. Finally, they confirmed it, but they wouldn't give me details on when did you detect it? How deep in the soil was it? Was groundwater affected? And I reached out to J.D. Vance's office asking for comment. Again, this is a political layup. Biden's EPA cover-up. No response. Same thing from Sherrod Brown's office.
Jordan, slow down a second. That's huge. So you were able to get a scoop. I'm not asking you to reveal your sources or anything here. I'm just trying to understand the situation. you were told by someone in the EPA, or you were able to do a FOIA request, or by some means, you were able to get information that the EPA had different internal statements about whether or not they had detected vinyl chloride than what they were disclosing publicly. And you pressed them on that. They gave you the runaround for a period of time, but ultimately admitted that they had, in fact, detected this toxic chemical in the soil, but had declined to disclose it to the public. What was the nature? Like, can you describe in more detail what they ultimately said to you, how they came clean?
Sure. And let's add the media to this, because the media is in on this cover up too. So, part of the benefit, and we're grateful to viewers who support us, is we keep in contact with residents. We keep going back to East Palestine. So residents reach out to us from time to time. So a resident who lives right outside of East Palestine called me and said, I just got a text from Mark Durno of the EPA, and he acknowledged, because they had been digging up soil for weeks by the train tracks. And he acknowledged that, they recently detected vinyl chloride in the soil. He said, it was, quote, low levels. And I basically told her what to ask him. So we were talking kind of real time as she was communicating with this EPA official. He acknowledged they didn't tell the public. He kind of rationalized, it was low levels, yada, yada. Yeah, they said in Flint it was low levels, which was not true. So anyway, I had the text messages of him acknowledging this. I reached out to the EPA. They kind of didn't respond for a little bit, but then finally they responded acknowledging. They wouldn't tell me when. They said in early spring, we detected vinyl chloride. We quickly removed it from the soil. I followed up. Well, if you're removing it from the soil, how did you do that? Did you test the air? Because vinyl chloride, when released into the air, in a few days turns into formaldehyde and other concerning things. And they just gave me a boilerplate statement. I don't know. I didn't go to journalism school. I take that as a badge of honor, because I think they teach you a lot of crap. But this is a major scandal, as you said. I reached out to Vance's office, to Brown's office, to the Pennsylvania senators. I reached out to Ohio media, Pennsylvania media. I reached out to the Washington Post. Hey, do you want to do this with me? They responded, oh, we'll pass. I responded, what do you mean you'll pass? Like, this isn't like I say tomato, you say tomato, differences of what's the story. I got the EPA is admitting it here, and I have the text. It was a major, major story. I got confirmation that an Associated Press reporter confirmed it after me, for some reason, didn't report it. Other Ohio media reached out to my source, which wasn't hidden. She went on the record to confirm it, yet they didn't report it. And then I found out after the fact that Norfolk Southern and the EPA are basically harassing local reporters not to report certain things. That's why it's not dramatic to call this a cover up. That's what's going on. But bottom line, EPA.
Tell me more about that. What do you mean they're harassing local reporters? Reporters have told you that they've been pressured not to report on things like this?
Yeah. So my source, Christina Sisiloff, she lives right outside of East Palestine. She's been sick. Her kid's been sick. After I broke the story, I had to do it in Substack because the Washington Post and others passed. She was contacted by local reporters in Ohio, Pennsylvania, for more information. That was the red flag to me right away, because my story had the text messages and had the EPA statement. I get like outlets want to independently confirm things, but there really wasn't anything to independently confirm.
Sure.
I had the visuals and the EPA statement acknowledging it, even though they wouldn't answer my specific questions. And then she told me, I didn't hear directly from reporters, but she told me that reporters she has spoken to have told her that, when they're working on stories, the EPA and Norfolk Southern has called their editors, and therefore they were told, those reporters, were made to stand down. I spoke with a Associated Press reporter saying, hey, I was told that you confirmed my reporting. When should I expect to see this Associated Press story? He got back to me. Yeah, I'm working on a couple things right now, but I'm following up. I responded, I thought respectfully, I don't really know what else you're working on, but the EPA for the last year and a half has been denying that they're detecting the cancerous chemicals that were blown up over this town. I think you should expedite it. I did a whole Substack story naming names of reporters that told me they confirmed my story, but hasn't reported it. I can't get in their heads, but it makes no sense that the Associated Press wouldn't report this. The Cleveland, Plain Dealer, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. I mean, I think I'm reputable. I've never had to correct any stories. I have the EPA on the record acknowledging this. So all I could think, I have heard from numerous sources, and I've spoken with reporters too in the past, that the EPA and Norfolk Southern, when larger outlets than I are, working on something, they have pushed them not to report it.
I mean, your point of comparison between the sort of focus on Boeing and the disinterest in East Palestine, it is an interesting one. And I do wonder to what degree there's an interest in Boeing because the kind of people who, have money and, buy subscriptions to newspapers or whatever it is, fly planes and aren't necessarily living next to train routes where these derailments happen that are routinely routed through lower income communities precisely because of the danger inherent in moving hazardous chemicals.
I mean, I could take you through Flint and my last 8 years of reporting. My book will show that literally a local ABC station in Flint killed a story on the Legionnaire's disease, which killed a whole lot of people in Flint. 6 months after the water switch, they still won't respond to me, this local ABC station, on why they killed it. I had people, residents in Flint, telling me that reporters from major outlets were apologizing to them because their bosses at ABC and elsewhere wouldn't send them back to Flint anymore, a year later. I've had the same thing in East Palestine. I could put you in touch with residents who were contacting producers, and producers from major networks were telling them apologetically, we want to keep reporting on this. We want to cover it, but we were shot down to keep coming back. I could only tell you, based on my experience over the last decade, if you're poor and black in Flint, the folks in New York and DC that litter our cosmopolitan media set don't seem that interested on staying on the story. If you're poor and white and conservative in East Palestine, I mean, that East Palestine is conservative, and it's flyover country. I don't necessarily think the pundits on CNN frequent East Palestine that much. They don't seem as interested. But if it's Boeing, which affects everybody, particularly people who could afford to fly frequently and travel, it's a major corrupt scandal. But in fact, and I haven't investigated Boeing that much, but from what I know, it's much more black and white in terms of the cover up with Norfolk Southern. There's a lot more evidence in terms of the cover up and the intentional sacrificing of this community than there is with Boeing. Yet it's not the same media response. It's not the same media coverage. And that's stunning to me because, as I talk about in my book in Flint, and I believe is the same thing in East Palestine, when people think about cover-ups, they generally think about the government. In my experience, the reason that these cover-ups are allowed to happen and then persist, and the narrative becomes, oh, Flint is fixed, or oh, East Palestine, they're fixing that, is because the media is in on the cover-up. Are the journalists all dastardly, evil people that are intentionally trying to suppress it? No, I don't think it's as simple as that. But for their job security or other reasons, they are not following up or reporting the full truth. I mean, it's a massive story that the EPA detected a toxic cancerous chemical that was detonated over this community and did not notify the public and will not answer questions about it. Yet there is no national media outlet that has reported it. The only place that has even followed up on it is the Government Accountability Project. And that is really alarming because why I keep covering these things, sure, it's just like mass shootings. You think, oh, this can't happen. This will never happen where I'm from. Well, it can. It might not be a railroad. It might not be water. It might be fracking. It might be a plastics factory. It might be BP. But there could be an emergency or a chemical contamination in your community. And if the playbook simply is the EPA does some testing and says everything's fine, the politicians show up for a photo op and pretend they're doing something, but generally, go along with the narrative that everything's fine. and the media stops covering it, we're going to have a lot more sacrifice zones.
I mean, I think the most cynical and perhaps in some ways most tragic explanation is that it's not even necessarily some scheme or pressure from the moneyed interest behind these corporations that are causing folks to be disinclined to cover it, but simply, and I think we've talked about this in the past, the nature of the financial incentives behind the media cycle and how difficult it is to try to manage your obligations to like pull an audience and get clicks and gin up readership and actually cover the things that matter, even if they're no longer sexy and interesting. In East Palestine, I remember when we were covering it on the Hill, and because Republicans were weaponizing it to ding Biden, rightly so, I would argue, then there was this appetite for it because it really was a Biden story. It wasn't so much, I mean, even when it was being covered, the core interest always felt like it was about the politics as opposed to the raw tragedy of what was befalling the people of East Palestine. And as soon as it could no longer be weaponized in a certain way, eventually they sent Buttigieg, eventually I think Biden went. And things, the attention turned elsewhere, then it didn't matter if there was an ongoing crisis. And there's something that I think is particularly depressing about that it might not even be, oh, I'm getting pressured not to cover it. It's just that the media attention can only be held for so long. And I will say very honestly, long before my unceremonious termination from the Hill, it was dispiriting to watch the kind of balance of, well, we gotta cover Joe Rogan saying this about Bill Maher because if those names are both in this clip, this is going to do very well, and then maybe I can get my, someone from The Lever or someone from Status Coup on as like the vegetables later in the segment because we've like paid our dues and feeding the audience the candy that is going to drive the clicks on the other side of this. And as someone like yourself who not just doggedly focuses on these issues, but commits resources to sending people to these locations to talk to folks and conduct interviews on the ground, I do wonder how you're feeling about all of this and how you're feeling about the sustainability of this model.
I mean, I'd be lying if I didn't have a lot of moments where I think of or worry about having to fold up the tent. I mean, I wouldn't be honest. I think there's a misnomer out there about vegetables versus treats in terms of what you serve up the audience, because I don't think it's not like a sexy topic and it goes over people's heads, but there's a lot of algorithmic manipulation that props up artificially, not naturally, certain types of content. I don't really think it's that viewers are necessarily not interested in stories like Flint or East Palestine. It's more there is a algorithm like a lever force feeding certain content while suppressing other content. Because in my experience back in the 2010s, when I was at the Young Turks, before YouTube dramatically changed its algorithm and these other platforms changed their algorithm, this kind of content did very well. And the Young Turks actually had some of their best numbers in terms of paid signups for membership when I was on the ground at Flint or Standing Rock. Views on Facebook and elsewhere were through the roof. There has been algorithmic tweaking or manipulation that props up the Joe Rogan type content or reacting to Ben Shapiro or whatever the Hill, wanted you to cover versus, what we consider vegetables. But most people are interested in environmental cover-ups or government corruption. They're just not, that's not what pops up in their feeds. I mean, don't even get me started on Twitter or whatever the hell that is now. The second thing I'll say is, people think of censorship in terms of just, pushing people off platforms. That is obviously the worst form of censorship, but the normalized form of censorship is the shadow censorship, where what I'm talking about, that certain content is suppressed algorithmically. When we first covered East Palestine, when it happened, I guess YouTube's algorithm let up. I mean, we were getting like, 1,000 to 2,000 live viewers on the ground in East Palestine, not just like an immediate aftermath, even a month later. Our videos were getting at some points 100,000 more views. People are really interested. But it then seems like the algorithm changes. Same thing happened on the Gaza issue. Our protest coverage initially, I mean, we were getting 2,000-3,000 live viewers. We've been covering the protests all over the country for months. Now it's a lot less. Do people suddenly stop caring, or they don't see it as much? And there's been reporting and research studies about this algorithmic suppression. The other thing, people just really, because the media doesn't report, I bet you don't know, when Biden came to East Palestine, do you know he did his event at a candle shop? They're literally doing events, not at City Hall or public buildings, but at the candle shop to conceal the smell of the chemicals. I mean, this is what's going on. The media doesn't report. They didn't report that he was in a candle shop and ask, why is he doing this event? And I mean, that's why I call it a cover up. So I think there's so much information that is not reported. I understand, the big boys like CNN and all these outlets, their incentives is just to kind of make politics a sport. But the problem is people are getting sick all around the country because of the void of real coverage of what's actually happening. And I fear right now, Flint, why I say it's still a disaster and a crisis, cancer is surging in Flint. I mean, certain cancers are up 200 to 300%. That's not reported in the media. And I fear East Palestine is going to be similar. And if you want to circle back to J.D. Vance, I mean, he could have been a hero in this case if he would have called for the things that need to be called for. He needs to explain, why is he not responding to reporting an EPA confirmation that they concealed they found vinyl chloride? He hasn't said a word. Why isn't he calling for criminal charges or even investigation against Norfolk Southern? He's been given the evidence. Crickets. It doesn't make a lot of sense.
The JD Vance piece of this is interesting because on one level, it doesn't matter what JD Vance wants, thinks, or believes. He's a VP. VPs don't matter. He has to sublimate his interest to Trump, just like Kamala. Whatever we want to wish cast into her heart and soul, she was Biden. That is what it is. But I was reading this article in the New Yorker. It was published on July 22nd. It's called J.D. Vance and the Empty Promises of Conservative Economic Populism, talking about his RNC speech and what we should make of it. And it kind of charts that there was this kind of new conservatism, this new movement that he was a part of, that emerged. It says, after doing some obligatory bowing and scraping to the man at the top of the ticket, it's talking about the RNC, the 39-year-old junior senator from Ohio practically stomped on the grave of neoliberalism, the internationalist, corporate-friendly, free market economic philosophy that dominated the Republican Party from 1980 to 2016. Vance criticized NAFTA, decried unlimited global trade, gave a shout out to Social Security, used the term big business pejoratively, conspicuously avoided the budget deficit and the national debt, and proclaimed that Trump's GOP was done catering to Wall Street. We'll commit to the working man, he added. And then the article goes on to talk about the hypocrisy of that kind of stance with his history in venture capitalism, and the various alliances and appointments that Trump has made over the course of his career. But he also gets into the underlying kind of political background that Vance comes from and talks to this guy called Scott Winship, who's a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, who talks about what he calls, quote, a tribe that everyone has forgotten about, the reform conservatives. This group who basically, quote, thought that the Republican Party needed to move beyond the tax cuts and deregulation with which it had been associated since the day of Ronald Reagan and Milton Friedman, and that it should tackle pocketbook issues such as childcare, healthcare, and job displacement. I'm reading all of that, and it does seem like there is a real kind of legacy or tradition that Vance is drawing on. It obviously isn't mine. And I think the way that he talks about his family in Hillbilly Elegy is instructive, but it is also kind of unnerving to me as a left populist to see that there might be someone with such a platform as the vice presidential spot, who can convincingly and maybe even authentically speak to some narrow version of right populism in a world where there is no left populism represented at those kind of high ranks. And you have AOC and Bernie and all of them going all in on Biden and seemingly kind of lost and without any credibility at this moment. And so that is why I'm kind of interested. Like, how credible is it? How much would he push this issue? How authentic is this belief in a kind of narrow family values focused, whatever criticisms you want to make of it, kind of populism that really might appeal to people in Ohio and beyond? And might we, after criticizing him for not doing more in this moment, might we show up, turn on the TV a day or a week or a month from now and find that he does exactly the kinds of things that we're saying that he should do in terms of advocating for healthcare for the people of East Palestine, or, criminal liability for Norfolk Southern and the like?
I think that's the ultimate problem in politics. I think people are so desperate, doesn't matter, progressive, conservatives, so desperate for some type of structural change that it's easy to kind of buy into, a good sales job, which is how Trump got elected. There was no actual record of Donald Trump as a businessman or just a public speaker advocating for the working class. And the same thing of J.D. Vance. I mean, an example, we were on the ground covering the UAW strikes last year for several weeks. We covered it in Michigan, Ohio, Illinois. That was the first time UAW and most of these workers ever even heard from J.D. Vance. There was a clip that went around of J.D. Vance showed up to a picket line. It was kind of given the cold shoulder, I believe, by Marcy Kaptur.
Very well. How you doing? Nice to see you, Marcy. Good to see you. Yeah. First time here?
First time here. Yeah.
Thank you for coming.
Of course. Yes.
All right. What can we do for you?
So, talk is cheap.
That's the one where she was like, first time here?
Yeah. I mean, talk is cheap. You might have been able to have the wonderful book that cast you as, the prodigy of Appalachia and really caring about these issues. But the record is the record. I mean, the Lever, I believe, reported that he watered down his own railroad regulation bill to delay by several years railroad companies having to bolster their tank cars, basically produce or put forth more fortified tank cars so that things like East Palestine don't happen. That's his own bill, and he, after lobbyists swarmed him, amended it to delay that implementation. He's never been a friend of labor. Trump.
And he can't be, right? Because fundamentally, if you're someone who is in Congress because you were basically funded by Peter Thiel, I mean, this is like the basic understanding of left power dynamics that is really what's so frustrating about hearing these right populists make all of these obviously empty promises. Peter Thiel's interest is not in more regulation, whether it's train cars or any other kind of thing. And if he's funding you, you are going to have limits on what you can, in fact, say and enact when you actually get into positions of power. And what you say or do when you're in a minority in Congress, or when whatever it is that you're advocating for isn't going to pass anyway, is not a harbinger of what people can actually expect from you long term when you do accrue power.
Right. And by the way, he's gotten credit, I believe, for Matt Stoller and others. Same thing with Josh Hawley, for kind of some talk of breaking up monopolies. Have you ever heard J.D. Vance criticize Amazon or call for tighter regulation on Amazon? So I think talk is cheap. And I think Peter Thiel and, kind of the puppet masters that prop up people like J.D. Vance are very smart. And they know who is serious versus who can sell populism. I don't think Peter Thiel would have funded J.D. Vance, I believe, to the tune of $20 million to get him in the Senate if he actually thought, oh, this guy's really for raising the minimum wage and, tighter regulation and labor unions and et cetera, et cetera. And there's no record of J.D. Vance being for those things. And it's not just, the attention is on J.D. Vance flip-flopped on Trump in terms of, he went from calling Trump a mini Hitler to Trump's the greatest thing since sliced bread. But he also flip-flopped. He, at first, called out Trump for only offering tax cuts and deregulation. Well, that's what Trump is offering right now. He wants to lower the corporate tax rate down to 15%. from 21%, which was already lowered by Trump, to 21%. He wants to, Project 2025 has a lot more tax cuts for wealthy people. That's what Vance is attaching himself to. So I think the word populist gets thrown around. You could talk like a populist. And, when I challenged some Trump supporters respectfully back in 2016 and 2020, when I kind of looked underneath the hood at Trump's policies, a lot of them weren't aware of a lot of his policies because they were only watching Fox News. And I think it's probably similar with J.D. Vance. They're probably not quite aware of the bills he has signed on to, his votes, and the money. I say follow the money. It's very simple. Follow the money.
Yeah.
And the money tells the story. And by the way, yes, we could say, well, how much does the vice president matter? Well, Donald Trump's diet is cheeseburgers and Diet Coke for the last 30 years. I'm not saying he's on death's door. He's not a young man. And Donald Trump, we think, if reelected, could only serve one more term. It's not without question that this man could be president in 4 years. So vice president, I agree, generally doesn't matter in terms of the election and putting someone over. But it's not beyond question, even though I think he's hella awkward on the campaign trail. It's not beyond question this man could be president within the next couple of years.
I was going to say, speaking about awkwardness, Donald Trump might be eating McDonald's hamburgers every day for dinner, but J.D. Vance is drinking Diet Mountain Dew, rather.
Mountain Dew. Right.
It is the weirdest thing to me. Democrats say that it is racist to believe, well, they say it's racist to do anything. I had a Diet Mountain Dew yesterday and one today. I'm sure they're going to call that racist too, but it's good. I love you guys. But these people were telling jokes up in the front row. You guys might not be able to hear it, but I'm getting caught up in it.
I think he had his please clap moment the other day.
Right. Do you think I have to confess, I haven't heard him speak that much. It's like one of these Ron DeSantis things where I'm realizing in the moment, like, oh, actually, I don't really know much about what he sounds like and how much riz he's got. And the takeaway seems to be now that, oh no, maybe he actually is a political liability that people didn't quite appreciate. Do you think that was a bad moment, or do you have a sense of whether or not he actually is kind of rizless, is lacking in charm?
In my experience covering politicians, when they are actually being authentic, that's when they speak the best. So, for example, Hillary Clinton, she's certainly not my cup of tea. She spoke the best when she was talking about, Syria or Russia or the things that animate her because she's a warmonger. She spoke poorly when talking about, the working class, or when she tried to, because she hasn't driven in 30 years and she has no connection to the working class. J.D. Vance, I think, gets in trouble, and the awkwardness comes out when he's trying to do this populist shtick and when he's trying to be like a son of Appalachia, because that's not who he really is. I think he speaks most authentically when talking about his upbringing and, some of the obstacles he had, because that's who he is. But when he's trying to pretend that he's this populist and the whole, cultural conservatism, I think he was speaking authentically when he was on MSNBC in 2016 saying he believed Trump's accusers, because I think that's who he really was. I think he was being authentic and taking a brave stand of going against Trump. But he kind of has prostituted himself politically. And I think when you're not talking authentically, some politicians could pull it off and just be complete fakes and it come off authentically. I don't think he can. And I think that's what's showing up on the campaign trail, where he kind of seems flat, or the zingers he's trying to deliver just don't zing, because I think he's kind of molded himself into what he thinks he has to be to sell himself to MAGA. I actually thought it was a mistake when Trump picked him. I thought it could be, even though I thought it was a mistake, I didn't think it would be a big deal, because I, at that point, thought it would still be Biden. But the fact that he's on the record for a national abortion ban, that he's called for tracking women's periods, Harris and the Democratic Party, that was the one issue that could kind of save them. And there's going to be a lot of ads on his vice president who could become president. And I also think, frankly, that there's not a long track record of him speaking. that would.
Yeah. And you're telling me, Jordan, that I missed that both VPs, prior to Biden dropping out, had accused the principal, had accused the presidential candidate of basically believing their sexual assault accusers prior to being picked as VP. Because remember, Kamala also said she believed the women that had accused Joe Biden of sexual assault back in 2019 or whenever that happened. You're saying that JD Vance also said that of Trump?
Yeah, there's a clip that's recently surfaced he was on MSNBC in 2016, saying he was inclined to believe her, and if it's a he said, she said, I would take the woman's word.
His hands were all over me. He was like an octopus. It was like he had 6 arms. He was all over the place. But it's when he started putting his hand up my skirt, and that was it. That was it. I was out of there. I wish the stewardess would come and rescue me. And then I decided, I got up, I got my purse, and I said, I'm going back to my seat and coach.
What do you think of this? This is sort of, it's sort of interesting, evocative of the time, because we used to say stewardess, first of all, now we say flight attendant, but just it gives you that sense of history. But this woman is not a show-off. She's just telling what happened so we can know it.
Yeah, and it's sort of, it makes you think that at a fundamental level, this is sort of a he said, she said, right? And at the end of the day, do you believe Donald Trump, who always tells the truth? Just kidding. Or do you believe that woman on that tape?
No, denial is normal.
And by the way, I mean, it kind of got lost in the shuffle of the insanity. I mean, RFK Jr. Was just, I think, credibly accused of assaulting his nanny. And he didn't deny it and said there might be other women that come out. So we've come a far cry from that being the number one story on news. But Vance, I believe the Vance of 2016, who I think at least took some courageous stance against Trump. The Vance now, I think he's going to run into some of these issues because I don't think he's actually being his authentic self on the campaign trail. And I don't tell people who to vote for. It's up to you, but follow who is funding Harris, follow who is funding Trump, and follow who is funding Vance.
And follow who is funding some of these independent candidates that are genuinely independent. I'd say that as well. Thank you so much for joining me here today. Jordan, can you really tell people why they should buy your book? I think this is important.
Yes, I appreciate that. Listen, I think in the cacophony of crises that go on every day, it's really hard to remember what happened last week. I mean, Trump was nearly assassinated, and it's no longer in the news, really. Why you should buy my book? I believe that America basically is a multi-trillion-dollar corporate conglomerate masquerading as a representative government. I don't think we really have a government anymore. I think we have a cabal. And I think my book is going to expose, and it has been told to me, the biggest government cover-up of the 21st century. That is not sexy because it's not in Washington, it's in Flint. But the book exposes major new bombshell revelations about the government cover-up from top down, from the EPA to the former governor of Michigan, to Wall Street, which was involved, to Republican politicians, to Democratic politicians, including the current Democratic Attorney General and the current Democratic governor, who has been rumored about as a potential president, Gretchen Whitmer. If that's not sexy to you, a government cover-up, then I think you need to fine-tune your priorities list. And I want, most of all, obviously I want as many people to get the book as possible. I want the people of Flint to know what really happened because they have been deserved. And I think it's really important, not just for Flint, but for East Palestine. If we don't get what really happened, who, what, when, why did this, because the media narrative has been bullshit. If we don't get that out and we don't know how this happened and how a community was poisoned and then left to die 10 years later, if that truth is not out there, then the playbook is solid to do it to other people and other communities, which sadly is happening in East Palestine. So the book's out August 6th. I'll be in Flint for an event that night, August 6th. I'm doing some other events, and I'm really hoping, independent media, I'm not holding out my breath for CNN or others, but hopefully I could, get on other independent media shows like yourselves, because there's major bombshells, like how you reacted to the EPA covering up vinyl chloride, there's about 10 of those in this book that the people that I trust that have read it were like, how the hell was this not all over the place? And I don't have an answer. All the stuff that's in this book could have been discovered by mainstream reporters. They chose to abandon the story.
Yeah, it's such important work, Jordan. If people don't think this is sexy, I don't know what to tell you. It's time to go to the doctor and ask why you're not getting horny for corporate accountability, for government accountability, because it's all right there. And I really do appreciate you, Jordan. I just value the handful of people who are still doing original reporting on the left. It's so hard. We've seen what's going on with The Intercept. You know, I don't know. The entire media infrastructure, the left media infrastructure, is dependent on you guys doing original work. Otherwise, we're just talking about Ross Douthat's op-eds endlessly, and it's meaningless and dumb. And I have so much admiration for what you do, and I really encourage everybody to support you, to subscribe to your YouTube channel. If you just happen to see one of your videos, just like it. Even if you don't have time to watch it in the moment, make sure you subscribe, like, drop a comment, all of these things that help boost the algorithm. And if, of course, you can contribute financially, do that as well. Where can people find you on the internet and beyond?
Yeah, Status Coup on YouTube. We're almost at 200,000 subscribers. So if you don't know, go subscribe now. Status Coup, COUP. And the book is called We the Poisoned, Exposing the Flint Water Cover-Up. And you can still pre-order it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, etc. And thank you very much. Of independent media, you've had me on quite more than others, so I appreciate it.
Oh, anytime. And I'm sorry I can't bring you on Rising anymore, but I hope they still are reaching out to you as well.
No, they're not, so that's fine.
Oh, all right. Well,
that's okay.
Maybe I'll DM Jessica and see if we can get something going there. All right. Yeah. Thanks again. Thanks to all of you for listening. Thank you for supporting this podcast at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast and also supporting on social media and beyond. Take care of yourselves. And as always, keep the faith. Hey, YouTube. Thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.